delighted to welcome you to this session. As you know, the session is to deal with financing green growth plans, agriculture, and food security. The topic, of course, is tremendously important for all sorts of reasons. The World Economic Forum had looked at this issue, and we have all seen the triangle of sustainable development with economic, environmental, and social. But then they had put, instead of economic, the food security part of it as part of the three triangles, saying that how important it is. But as you all know, the emissions, the concentration of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere have gone beyond the number 400 parts per million, and the impacts of climate change on various things on Earth, including food security, are very pronounced. And this matter is looked at from various angles, not just from the climate impacts point of view, but in terms of the planetary boundaries point of view. The issue that was considered most severe is how we're using the nitrogen and what it means for nutrient management on Earth and the implications for human society. And actually, the issue of nitrogen is given even greater prominence in terms of the planetary boundaries in the red area. And we have here some of the finest experts from various countries to discuss these important issues. We have, what I propose to do is the following. I'm going to first introduce our participants and then give each of them in turn the chance to speak on the issue of the session. And then there will be a conversation amongst us for a while with some follow-up questions by me. And at the end of it, you will have an opportunity to engage the participants in the panel with some of your own questions. Let me begin by first introducing Your Excellency, the Minister from Ministry of Agriculture from Ethiopia, Ato Seleshi Getahun. He spoke this morning already, and there was some introduction of him, but let me say that Ethiopia in particular has been in the forefront of this green growth movement for quite some time and has played a very prominent part in the climate financing special group that the Secretary General had created. And I'm not going to say very much more about the Honorable Minister. The background is in the book that we have seen. Our next speaker is going to be His Excellency Dr. Christian Fritz Bach, who again also spoke this morning and made a very powerful speech, and I hope that he would tell us a little bit more about where he left off and then make the connection with what we are proposing to do in this session. He is, of course, Minister for Development Cooperation in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Denmark, and has a very rich background that is very appropriate for this particular session. He has been a professor in the University of Copenhagen and worked as also as an international director at a Danish NGO. And so I hope you bring us the experiences from the academic, governmental, and of course the NGO circles on this important issue. Our third speaker is going to be Ms. Shailene Thompson. She has been with the Ministry of in the Government of Australia, in the Department of Climate Change and Energy Efficiency, has been a regular at the climate negotiations for quite some time, and also brings with her a very rich experience that goes back all the way to Kyoto Protocol negotiations and the adoption of that agreement and the implementation of various issues since then. She is currently the head of land division in the Department of Industry, Innovation, Climate Change, Science, Research and Tertiary Education. A very long title for the department, but I'm sure you would tell us about the connection of the food security with the climate negotiations and so on. Our last speaker is Mr. Varad Pandey. I had the pleasure of working with him many years ago in his former capacity as the special officer on special duty for the Ministry for Environment. He's, of course, also, again, as with the other speakers, well versed in not just the climate negotiations but the global sustainability, worked as the Sherpa to the minister who is a member of the Secretary General's Global Sustainability Panel, and brings with him an enormous amount of experience on how these issues are dealt with in not only Government of India but globally. So without further ado, let me invite His Excellency Getahan to speak to these issues first.
Thank you, dear colleagues. The green growth and agriculture in Ethiopia is the main and the priority. You know, almost 85% of our people are dependent on agriculture. The major areas of agriculture is livestock and crop production, and we have very big involvement of the farmers. Most of the agricultural activities in the country are concentrated on the highland areas. And similarly, we have also the livestock production in the pastoralists in the lowland areas, where the lowland areas are again, they suffer from an alternate between drought and flooding. And sometimes also the lack and shortage of livestock feed because of the animals trampling from here and to other places. See, the major, according to our assessment, that the major greenhouse gas emitters will be from agriculture, in which crop and livestock will take the major one. Our livestock is, in terms of feed conversion efficiency, is very low. And in terms of the species, also in terms of productivity, they are low. So the emission from livestock in terms of methane is higher. It actually reaches around 65 metric ton per metric ton carbon dioxide equivalent. The other one is from the crop, of course, from frequent land cultivation. So knowing all these problems, we are undertaking the watershed management activities that focuses on improving the soil fertility, and mainly focusing on water conservation on highlands, and also water exploration and the water development in lowland and pastoral areas also. So through that, we could manage to reclaim the degraded areas. The other important point is forest areas. We used to have around 40% of the country was covered by forest some years ago. Then that goes down to 3% until the recent time. Now, since we started to implement and through intensive tree plantation and watershed development, we could improve the forest cover to 11%. And through reduction of deforestation and forest degradation. So an area that we actually identified to focus on agriculture for food security is, in one hand, reclaiming and retaining, at the same time changing the land, degraded land, and keeping the environment safe. And on the other hand, also increasing productivity in order to feed the people and also feed the livestock. So our focus is on those areas, and at the same time also promoting forest plantation and tree plantation activities. In the last few years, we could manage to plant every year billion of tree seedlings, and we also try to combine this with water harvesting activities, in which many farmers in highland areas, and many farmers in crop producing and livestock producing areas, they are getting out of poverty. So combination of both the agricultural green growth activities and economic development, and that again linked with the welfare of the society, social activities that we undertake, is making a change and bringing a change. So agriculture, food security, because our people in the rural areas they are farmers. So without that, it is impossible also for the economy to go up. Therefore, the agriculture and the food security are the main that we actually consider. In this regard, in terms of technology transfer, we need the technology that actually boost productivity, because one of the low agricultural productivities that we have in the country. So we need to have more of the activities or technologies that can boost the productivity, and at the same time also to have better price also for the farmers, so that the farmers can be encouraged to produce more, and at the same time environment can also be saved in that regard. So I think just to start our discussion, these are the issues that I just wanted to bring up.
Thank you, Minister. Now let's go to Minister Bach. You, sir, have identified the important role of the policies in your comments this morning. And of course, we're talking about financing for green growth and agriculture and food security. Given the issues identified by your colleague from Ethiopia, how do you see the food production can increase and the role of policies for technology transfer as well as financing?
Thank you very much. Well, I'm pleased to be part of this panel of an issue that's keen to my heart, both, as you said, with my formal background, but also I'm a farmer myself and have a small farm and try desperately to understand the intricacies of farming, and grew up on farms as well. And I always enjoy visiting farmers, and my recent visit that I told a little bit about this morning to Ethiopia showed to me the importance of good policy and strong community involvement and how that can come together. It was extremely inspiring, and I didn't quite understand what made it work in this small village in Ethiopia. But I think the combination of social policy, ag policy, environmental policy, you have to have the totality of it together. And too often we have been thinking in silos in agricultural policy or in other areas, and you need to have the broad combination of policies, because these farmers in this village in Ethiopia that I visited, what allowed them now to do the water harvesting was the productive safety net program, because it allowed them, as they said, it changed two things in the village. They got this small transfer of food or cash that allowed them to stay on the land. Before, they were running around all over the place in order to earn a little bit of money, so they could never invest in their own land. But now with that safety net, they could stay on the land. The other thing it brought is, because they have to work 5 days a month, it brought them to work together. So then they started from the top of the mountains, harvesting water all the way down, constantly raising the water level, and now irrigating and having 3 crops a year, a desert turning into a food basket. So the combination, and planting the trees as well, so there's also a climate issue here. There's a lot of carbon capture in the program as well, building up the soil fertility, forest, all of it. But the combination of the social policies and the ag policies, and I think Ethiopia has done a lot of this right. Also, if you look at the combination between growth and poverty reduction in East Africa, you would find that Tanzania, Ethiopia have had high growth rates, both of them. But because the agricultural policy in Ethiopia has focused so much on small-scale farmers, the poverty impact has been much larger than in Tanzania, where perhaps the agricultural policies have focused a little bit more on export agriculture and large-scale plantations. And I think that is, again, showing us how can you do sustainable development, and good agricultural policy is absolutely key. I have been for a long time following the Doing Business Index, and I know how it has inspired African leaders to change their policy, because they sit and look at the index and they say, look, we are too low. I know the president of Tanzania, he got very inspired by that doing business, and he went home to his people and said, look, we are too low, do something about it. And they did something, and the enabling environment for businesses really improved in Tanzania. So I wanted for long to say we need a doing agriculture index as well. And we are actually working quite closely with the World Bank, with USAID, with IFPRI, with FAO, with a number of institutions trying to now make a doing agriculture index. We need to know where is it good to be a farmer, and where do we have farm policies that enables farmers to create food security, growth, jobs, and also combat climate change at the same time. And those policies need to be in place, and it's a very complex set of policies, all the way from payment for ecosystem services to developing rural markets, and that's what is needed. So, but change can be made. It can be done in a village in Ethiopia, as I said it this morning, and I saw it, and it was really inspiring. And when summing up what is needed, I think the leader of this project, this village in Ethiopia, they call him Mr. Fire. Because he is on fire, kind of, and he's running around all the time. So they call him Mr. Fire. And we asked him, what is needed? And he said 3 things. Leaders must change their thinking about development. That's the most important thing. Number 2, leaders must have trust in their communities. Number 3. And number 3 is, when we then ask the government for support, they need to help us. So a responsive government, strong community leaders, good policies, and the thinking about sustainable development can change agriculture into a potential driver of both growth and sustainable development. Thank you.
Well, wonderful. That sets up nicely. We have 2 interventions where they have talked about the problems, but then they've talked mostly about identifying solutions at the national level. And of course, we are at this Global Green Growth Summit, and we know the contribution of agriculture sector to climate change. It's, I believe, almost 30%. Given that, the question, of course, is, these are initial comments, and you can speak more generally to them. But the question is, what are the international policy implications?
So thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak at this session. It's a great pleasure. As was mentioned in the introduction, I started in my career on these sorts of issues negotiating in the Climate Change Convention and on the Kyoto Protocol, and particularly on the land sector. In fact, I was one of the people that was trying to negotiate solutions to what was then called sinks in the Clean Development Mechanism. And that was a very difficult discussion in some ways, because in the context of climate change mitigation, reducing emissions, the land sector is somewhat unique. And I think one of the reasons why it is unique is because we have both the opportunity for things to go badly wrong, to put in place policy solutions that actually make things more difficult for a whole range of environmental indicators, but also conversely the opportunity to make things much better, that the so-called co-benefits set of issues, which I think are in a way at the heart of green growth. But it was that experience at looking at some of these policy problems on climate change in the land, and in particular what you do about permanence and additionality, that was very useful in Australia when we came to looking at a policy solution to reduce climate change emissions. And what we came up with was an offset scheme known as the Carbon Farming Initiative. And it's this that I was hoping to talk to you a little bit about today. Where I think the Carbon Farming Initiative is particularly interesting is because it blurs a little bit this distinction between reducing emissions, mitigating, and also adapting. Because what we found is that actually a lot of the things that you might want to do to build the resilience of your landscape, to assist local communities, to enhance agricultural production, are also the same sorts of things you do to adapt to climate change as well as reducing emissions. So I'd like to tell you about one of the things that we've seen starting to come forward under carbon farming, which is this idea that landholders can generate carbon credits by doing things like planting trees on their land. So we have this capacity whereby people can plant shelter belts for their stock, which mean that they can also have benefits in terms of biodiversity, addressing salinity, dealing with erosion, and also creating these carbon farming credits that can be traded into our carbon pricing mechanism, our emissions trading scheme. And of course, what that does is it equips the farm better to resist the effects of climate change itself, while also helping other players in the economy reduce their emissions. And we're seeing similar sorts of economic and sustainability benefits across the spectrum with carbon farming. We're at the moment working on a methodology, a set of rules at the project level, which will be about reducing fertiliser application. And this is quite exciting because one of the things we've found in Australia is that there's actually what I call a sweet spot for fertiliser application. There's a point at which putting more fertiliser on the land doesn't give you any more productivity, but it just increases your costs. The problem is that in order to know what the sweet spot is, you need to have quite good information about what your weather conditions are likely to be like and how various crops respond to different types of fertiliser. So we're working on this methodology whereby people will be able to get credit for reducing the amount of fertiliser they apply below a baseline. So that will reduce the costs that farmers actually have to experience, and it will also lead to other environmental benefits, including reducing emissions in terms of things like reducing runoff into our waterways, which is quite important when you think about the effect of agricultural runoff on things like the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. So I think the Carbon Farming Initiative has been a really exciting scheme. We've got 13 methodologies now agreed, sets of rules for the project. We've got over 60 projects that are now in place, and we've been, those people have been generating 1.7 million worth of carbon credits. So it's been exciting to watch the uptake of the scheme and how it's actually happening. And I think one of the things that it does is put in place a legislative framework which creates some certainty for players and also provides a framework for innovation and investment. So I could probably go on about it for quite some time, but perhaps I should stop now. Happy to take questions later on.
Indeed. Thank you very much. Mr. Pandey, we have seen, again, these are initial comments and I'll come to specific questions later on. It has been said that 97% of the agricultural workers in the world live in developing countries. And we talk about the impacts of climate change on agricultural production, and so there is a direct impact on the people and their livelihood, not to mention food security more globally. I wonder if you could reflect on that along with your initial comments.
Sure, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having us. And I thought I'll start a little bit by just giving some context of Indian agriculture, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Our situation is somewhat similar to Ethiopia's in the sense that despite despite projection otherwise, we are still largely an agricultural country. 55% of our workforce is still in agriculture, although it contributes only 20% of GDP. And what's even more interesting is that 85% of all our farmers are small and marginal farmers. So we don't have large farms. They're all under 2 hectares, essentially. And with population pressure, these land holdings are fragmenting further. Every generation it becomes even smaller. So we have a bit of a problem from that perspective. In the 1960s, we had what we called the Green Revolution, which actually transformed Indian agriculture in a way that made us from a food importing country to a food exporter. And this was the classic elements of high input fertilizers, pesticides, hybrid seeds, more water, that kind of model, which was in vogue at that time across the world. That really bailed us out in the 1960s and 70s. But what we find is that this traditional model of increasing agricultural production really doesn't work for small and marginal farmers. The costs are too high, the risks are too high, And so it's very clear to us that we need to think of an alternative model. At the same time, we have a huge food security issue as well. India is a country of 1.2 billion people, and our population is not likely to stabilize until at least 1.6 billion. So we need to continue to produce even more food on a reducing base of agricultural land for the next 40, 50, 60 years. And if that wasn't enough, just to complicate matters further, of course, the entire climate change angle, which all of us are familiar with. India is in particular affected by the weather pattern called the monsoons, on which largely, almost entirely our agriculture depends on, and research is only now beginning to even tell us, model in some ways on how monsoon patterns are being affected. What we do know, however, is that in a business as usual scenario, we're going to have falls in yields of almost about 25 to 30% in the next 30, 40 years. So there are many factors which are coming together which suggest that we need to act, and we need to act now, and we need to act fast. So what has India done? India has got, as part of its National Action Plan on Climate Change, there's a National Mission on Sustainable Agriculture, which is doing a series of interventions across various things, rain-fed agriculture, strategic planning in different agroclimatic zones, customized interventions for those agroclimatic zones, which will work, and then trying to ensure much better dissemination of these practices, which traditionally is a weakness, agricultural extension being a sort of a weak link in the way it's done. There's a very ambitious budget. We are planning to spend, just through public investment, about $20 billion additional to what we would otherwise spend on agriculture in the next 5 years. And that mission is sort of been launched a couple of years ago. It's on its way. But what I wanted to emphasize a little bit today was something else that we've started trying out 3 or 4 years ago, which is beginning to show remarkable results in my view. And this is basically community managed sustainable agriculture. This is not the big ticket, big R&D, big technology kind of stuff, but community managed sustainable agriculture. And really the entry point of this exercise is the belief that the poor have both the ability and the willingness to come out of poverty. And what you need to do is to harness that, to guide them and to help them in that process. So India today has now a very large program of setting up women's self-help groups across the country. Today there are 30 million women in India who are part of women's self-help groups across the country. These are essentially thrift and credit societies where you start by joining a group, you save every month some amount of money, eventually you set up a bank account, and then you borrow from the bank account for productivity enhancing activities. This has been quite successful in many Indian states. And what we are trying to do is now to leverage that institutional structure to do community managed sustainable agriculture, which relies much more on natural farming, based on local inputs, based on NPM, phasing out the use of pesticides and fertilizers, and local seed banks as well. And we find that this is actually working quite well. The key here, of course, is the knowledge dissemination part, which is understanding the local conditions, also trying to get back the knowledge, the traditional knowledge which resides with these farming communities, which over time have somehow been lost. But it's you need to sort of discover those and then propagate those practices for that particular region or zone. And at the root of this whole model, the root of this model really is the robust community institutions, because that really is the starting point for this to succeed. Otherwise it doesn't work. This is important because that's how we get the communities to learn about these practices. That's how we then get resource persons from these communities to propagate this in other parts of their province or in other parts of the country. And then we also use that to federate and create federations which can create market linkages, which can then help them get a better price for the produce that they produce. This of course has the economic impact, and some of our initial assessments show that there is an income effect of up to 50% from this new model, community managed sustainable agriculture, largely because there's a reduction in cost. They don't have to buy fertilizers and pesticides from the market, slightly improved productivity and better price realization through the federations that are created. There's of course the health aspect, the health hazards of using pesticides, especially on women, is well documented, and that comes down dramatically. There's a social aspect in the sense that because the women self-help groups are the entry point for this, for the first time, gender sensitivity in agriculture is becoming mainstreamed. And new kinds of tools and instruments which reduce the drudgery of work, especially for women, are also being developed through this process. And of course, largely, there's also the green or the environmental angle here, which is these are much more sustainable practices as far as agriculture are concerned, both in terms of biodiversity and climate mitigation. This is actually, as I said, 4 or 5 years of experience, but in some parts of our country, this has really taken shape. And in one of the provinces, which is called Andhra Pradesh, 25% of all farmland now is under this community managed sustainable agricultural practices with remarkable results on income. So we really think that this is something which has a lot of potential, both from an economic point of view, but also from an environmental point of view. You set ourselves a very ambitious target in the next 5 years. We want to reach 20 million farmers across the country, and hopefully it can be scaled up from there on. The one sort of lesson for me from this whole example is that the framing of, when we talk about green growth in agriculture, the framing of it has to be a livelihoods issue. If you want this to work with communities, people have to see the benefits of this in their day-to-day lives, more income, lesser risk, and outcomes which they can relate to. I think mitigation and other environmental benefits will be very useful byproducts. But if you want this to scale up, you've got to get the communities to own this. For that, they have to see the impact in their day-to-day lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pandey. Now let me go back to Minister Getterhorn. The panel, all of you have done extremely well in identifying what has been going on at the country level, and positioned, identified some of the things that are right and some of the things that are not so right and how to fix them. I'm trying to look at it more from the angle of not so much to internationalize the issue, but there is an international element to this. We're trying to increase agricultural production, and of course there are different needs. When you come to Africa, it is a question of not having enough fertilizer. But when you think about this from an industrialized country, particularly in the context of either Europe or North America, it is excessive use of fertilizer. And that has severe environmental consequences, starting with dead zones to various other epoxy and other health impacts. And it also has climate impacts. Coming from Ethiopia and looking more broadly at Africa and knowing what you do about food production in Africa, what do you think, if the suggestion is put to you that what we need to do is to really control how we use fertilizer? I mean, you talked about, capacity development exercises and a number of other things that you're talking about. Also, you talked about technology. So could you elaborate a little bit more on, the perspective from Africa? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a very critical issue that we need to address. There are two school thoughts in that regard. There are school thoughts that say productivity enhancement is impossible without inorganic fertilizer. There are other school of thoughts that productivity enhancement is possible without inorganic fertilizer. The advantage of organic fertilizer is that even once you use it, then you can use it for some 2 to 3 years, 3 times. The nutrient is there in the soil. Productivity enhancement from natural, I think is better than inorganic one. Of course, as you add more inorganic fertilizer, then you may have more production for the time being. But don't forget that we'll be increasing more nitrous oxide and other elements in the soil through leaching. And after some time also, as you were mentioning in your first speech that as you continue using the land with inorganic fertilizer, even you keep the land unproductive. Mm-hmm. So if we use the organic fertilizer, in one hand we are keeping also the environment we are taking care of the environment, and productivity can also be enhanced. Some of the research activities show that productivity can be increased from 54 to 179% from smallholders farmers. The only difference is that if you manage the water, if you can also get the adequate amount of organic fertilizer. Most of the cases, the problem with organic fertilizer is getting adequate number, producing adequate number, like composting and having green cover and like that. So the chance and the potential is there. We can increase productivity if we really focus on doing certain activities that we have to integrate with application of fertilizer. Water is important. Without water, you cannot go. Organic fertilizers can at least retain also water in the soil, particularly during the drought season. If there is a shortage of moisture, the organic fertilizers can retain some moisture in the soil. But inorganic fertilizers, you don't find that. Rather, they have a drying effect on that. So you can look into the environmental effect and at the same time also increasing productivity. It should not be in such a way that at the expense of the loss of the human income and economic income. It should not be at that expense that we talk about environment. So in one hand, the environment, we take care of the environment because we are worried about the world itself, because as we are continuing emitting greenhouse gas, then we will have more heat that is going to be accumulated. So the earth will not furthermore be, a place to live. So the choice is between living and, destroying the earth. So we are not, I think, we should not be greedy at this stage and at this level. So as we continue using the organic fertilizer, then you retain the soil as it is. We can also even tolerate the time when there is a prolonged drought. So even at the same time also the water that you accumulate or harvest can be retained in the soil. So water is available in the soil, accumulated. You have the nutrient that is supplied flows from organic fertilizer. And at the same time you have also tolerance from change in the environment. And you have taken also the care of the environment. If you boost the productivity in that way, I think productivity enhancement and taking out the farmers of the African farmers out of poverty would be possible.
Right. Thank you. Minister Fritzbach, given the challenge of the need for increasing food production, you believe organic fertilizer is would that solve our issues? And also I'd be interested in your comments from the European perspective in terms of the attention paid to excessive use of fertilizer and the impacts on a range of issues.
Sorry. When I visited Ethiopia, not this time I just mentioned, but 6-7 years ago, I also visited a group of farmers up in North Wallow, and then we sat down and talked. And at some point, I asked them, "How many of you use fertilizer?" And kind of 3 of them took the hand up. And then the project leader, he stood up and said, "We don't use fertilizer because this is an organic project." And then they took the hand down again. And I think, well, for me, the key is the farmer. The farmer has to be able to decide himself or herself. And it has to be an informed choice. I'm a true believer in organic growing methods. I think it can add a lot to soil fertility, combat erosion, build carbon in the topsoil in order to also mitigate climate change. There are so many benefits, but I think we need to have informed choices by educated farmers. That's what we look for, and we shouldn't. And I've also been in many African countries seeing, then you had the maize was this high, and next to it there was, and then you ask, difference here, and then they say we added a little bit of urea, and I think sometimes in these African soils are so kind of eroded and so lacking nutrients. So if you have a village with 5 goats, and you do 100 hectares, you're never going to have an organic system in balance there until you add some kind of fertilizer, at least in the beginning, in order to restore the soil fertility. But we should definitely engage much more in promoting sustainable development practices, and that's what we do in Danish development policy. We say sustainable agriculture, and sometimes, farmers may need to add some fertilizers, but let's definitely use all the tools we have in order to have a sustainable intensification of agriculture. That will be my position on that specific point. But informed choices by educated farmers, that's what we need to have, and we shouldn't force any farmer to do otherwise, but he should have incentives to do it and information to do it. That's also why payments for ecosystem services is so important. We can never solve the climate crisis without payments for ecosystem services, and we've only scratched the surface in what we need to do. In Europe, of course, my farm, it looks like a mess. It's kind of trees and grassland all over the place, because I'm paid the same, and I'm even paid more to leave the land fallow, and I'm paid more to plant the trees, and I'm paid more to have the grassland, because that's payment for ecosystem services. It has climate mitigation built into it. But we need to do it even more in Africa, for instance. Being able to pay farmers to change their behavior in a way that also mitigates climate change and build a strong natural resource base for them. The system, the productive safety net program, can be used as a payment for ecosystem services. I talked about that yesterday, and this morning and just before. But many more tools have to be developed, paying farmers and foresters to change their behavior, so it makes economic sense, and then give them good information in doing so. Fertilizer in Europe is a huge problem still, even so in Denmark. We are right now fighting with our farmers. I was just 2 days ago with a meeting with farmers in the northern part of Denmark, and farmers up there are a special stubborn breed, and they are also very vocal in voicing their dissatisfaction with the policies. And right now we are trying to introduce in Denmark that each to every stream or lake there should be 10 meters where you cannot grow, and where you cannot use fertilizer, and where you cannot use pesticides or anything. It should be left fallow in order to capture the excess fertilizer that you use on the farmland. And we've gone into big fight with Danish farmers on doing so, and they are compensated for it. I would say compensated enough, but they say, of course, that it's going to ruin them all. But it's a continuous fight, and we should definitely take a lot of the fertilizer used in Europe and use it in Africa instead.
Amazing. Ms. Thompson, we have 2 ministers here who are remarkable in the sense that they are talking about organic, farming and organic, fertilizers, and it's quite amazing. If we are not together in the same room and then not listening to you but only read the script, it would be hard to tell that one is from Africa and one is from Denmark. The point I'm trying to draw is that we do have industrial agriculture. We do have a great deal of contribution by that sector to global climate system, and we, as I said earlier on, we talked about a 30% contribution of it. I mean, a lot of it is coming from, of course, Europe and United States, and of course China and India, other countries. And so the question is, if it is truly an issue for the climate stability, maintaining climate stability, of course it's wonderful if we could have some kind of a transformational change, and if we could all go the route that is recommended by both our colleagues here. But in the interim, how do we regulate that sector and make sure that the food security is taken care of?
So I think one of the challenges is trying to think of these things in a holistic way rather than something of a binary opposition. So Australia is quite fortunate in as much as at the moment we don't have a food security problem. We're a food exporting nation. But I think we're very aware that as climate change happens and impacts on our landscape, that ability to continue to produce food and export food could potentially be at risk. And that's one of the reasons why the government's put in place the emissions trading scheme, the carbon price mechanism, and the carbon farming initiative sits alongside it as the offset scheme. And I think Christian's point about the payment for ecosystem services is absolutely key. And one of the challenges there is being able to involve local communities in that effort. So one of the things that we've done under carbon farming is created an approach whereby Indigenous communities can get carbon credits for changing the pattern of controlled burns in the country. So as people might know, Australia is very susceptible to fire, particularly in the north. So what we've done is established, through research, a methodological approach whereby Indigenous communities can actually reduce the amount of methane emissions from fires in the landscape by controlling the burn earlier in the season. And one of our Indigenous groups, the Land Corporation, has actually been able to reduce the fires on their land quite significantly, and are looking to generate 500,000 Australian dollars worth of carbon credits from this particular project. So I think that this notion of trying to engage Indigenous and other local communities in the mitigation effort, that can also lead to new revenue sources and draw more people into this provision of environmental services.
That brings me back to Mr. Pandey. The question that is oftentimes asked is, well, we're talking about this green growth, and then there are, as you know, there is a knowledge sharing platform and then the best practices. Is there any issue that you see in terms of agricultural production that could be made a principal part of the policy formulation agenda in that context?
Sure, I think you talked about the knowledge platform and everything. I think it's very important that we are able to share experiences like this of different contexts and learn from them, keeping in mind the caution that Minister Bach said, which is that the farmers must eventually make the decision. We need to give them a portfolio of options, but the context specificity is very important. What works in their context, and I think we need to incentivize farmers and enable them to take a little bit of risk so that they can try out the models that work for them. In our context, for example, you're aware that we have the Mahatma Gandhi Narega, which is the world's largest sort of rural employment guarantee program, which is largely to make public works. But what we've done in the last few years is to allow small and marginal farmers to make small investments in their own lands, also as part of that program. Essentially, the state is paying them. It's like a social security net of the type that you have in Ethiopia, where we are saying, look, we know you don't have the money to make those small investments which can have major impacts in your outputs and productivity. Why don't you do it with this money? And then they're doing simple things like drought proofing, or creating a source of water into their farm, improving the soil in some very simple kind of way. So I think there's a role for knowledge sharing, definitely, but I think even more important, there is a role for giving resources to farmers to try out things that work in their context and then adopt it.
Which brings us back to the capacity development that Minister Getahun is talking about. Thank you very much for that. Now, colleagues, you have the chance to ask questions of the panelists, and I believe we have a roving microphone, and my request is that you identify yourself and give the institution that you come from. And if you're asking question of a particular panelist, please state so that that person would be able to respond to it. And I have one there, and then the second. Yeah, I'll take say 5 questions, and then we'll go for the second round. Yes, first here, please. There is the microphone. Yeah, there it is.
The wire is not long enough.
The wire is not long enough.
I have a loud voice. So it's okay.
You do? Okay, then go ahead.
I'm Peter King. I'm a senior policy advisor with the Institute for Global Environment Strategies. Thank you very much for the presentation. But I feel from a sort of political policy perspective that there are a number of areas which have not really been touched on. And I think for this discussion about food security, it's really important to raise some of those. And in particular, I think we've glossed over the issue of excessive food consumption in the developed world, with the associated issues, food waste, the obesity epidemic, and the health issues that go with that, but triggered in part by massive agricultural subsidies. Europe's common agricultural policy, the US policies for farmers, in many ways. Australia also has significant subsidies to farmers, and we understand why these subsidies are necessary from a political economy perspective, and the Minister would be well aware of those political economy issues. But nevertheless, you know, I think the question of how do we create development space within the natural boundaries of the planet for increased production within the developing world. And this issue of getting the prices right, making sure that farmers from the developing world have the opportunity to compete in the global agricultural markets and to compete on a level playing field. And I think that's really critical. And in that context, you might also reflect on genetically modified organisms and the role of the large corporates in basically patenting life and then making farmers in developing countries absolutely dependent on those major global corporations to access seed and genetic varieties that they need to increase their productivity. Thank you.
Thank you. The lady right in the front. Hello. In the front, right here.
Thank you very much. My name is Enda. I'm from the National Development Planning Agency in Indonesia. Question, the key is sustainable farming, but the story is all of them are on a small scale. So how is it if a country have both small and big? How do we, you know, the theme is finance and policy, then how do we provide a policy to them? Because most of the example is on the ground. But of course then policy cannot be really specific, and we do have big and small, even medium. How do we provide a sustainable farming policy and also financial access to them, both you know, both all players, big, medium, and small. Specifically, a question to Ms. Thompson. I think carbon farming is interesting when you don't have a big competition on land for food security, probably. But then again, if in the future, or if some other country wanted to attract that because you want to implement that, how do you sort of put a sort of allocation or prevent then this carbon farming type of activities or incentive provided for that, not really jeopardizing the food security, because it may that risk for carbon farming is less as compared to risk of growing rice, growing you know, corn, and etc. And so, what is the you know, the perception or the regulation or policy to really allocate properly on that? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. If you could pass the microphone to the person next to you. Yes.
Hi, sorry, Sang-Min Nam from UNESCAP, and I have a question to Minister Ketang. This morning you highlighted the risk of you know, continuing conventional way of development with climate change. And this morning, Mongolian minister highlighted the background of why Mongolian is taking initiative for green development. She was highlighting that they cannot just rely on mineral capital only for one generation. Also, in a way to get support from local community, they have to improve mining's environmental practice. So my first question is, what is really political driving force for you to come up with a bold initiative for green growth? That's the first question. And second question is, this Danish minister, Mr. Park, also talked about the informed choice, importance of informed choice. And Mr. Pandey highlighted that this community-based movement, and especially the self-help groups, and really importance of initiative at local level, ground level. So what are the mechanisms you have to communicate with the local community, communicate with the farmers and mobilize them to really take action? Thank you.
Who else would like to ask questions?
Thank you, panelists. I'm Douglas from Papua New Guinea. I think my question would be way unfair to the panelists, but it would be fair to some of our participants here. In the context of food security, I think the focus here is on agriculture, green agriculture, to a large extent food security. My question is to seek your views, opinion, or get your views on the context of food security relating to countries that maritime countries, the source of food and income is basically comes from the sea. And in the context of food security, their livelihood is based or comes from maritime products. So I'd like to engage your views on this when it comes to the context of food security. Thank you.
Last question before we go back to the panel. Yes?
Hello, hi, my name is Sarah. I am also from UNESCAP. I have a question. I guess it's more, I don't know if it can be answered, but why is it good that we promote rural-based / community-driven agriculture? Because yes, I agree with the ideal, but I feel like those tend to be smaller scale farming, and I wonder how much those type of community / rural-based agriculture will help relieve food crisis, because we need much more food for the increasing population. So what would be the benefit, or what are the different new things that those rural-based agriculture would offer that the current large-scale genetically modified agriculture currently does not yet? Thank you.
Very good. Let's take from Minister Getahun and then go around. Yes?
Let me, if I just took the issues properly, with regard to the policy and the political strengths in terms of taking the green growth culture forward, is that the only reason is that, the major constraint, the challenge to food security and ensuring the farmers' growth, development of the country is land degradation in the country. And we also put in our policy that the number one enemy of the country is poverty, food insecurity. So how do we defeat that number one enemy? Was looking into what are the opportunities that we are having and the challenges. Our opportunities, the biggest opportunity is focusing on agriculture. But agriculture is again challenged by this climate change, the land degradation, loss of soil fertility, and at the same time also market that is actually coming now. So the politician will not have any other choice other than focusing on addressing those challenges that can challenge ensuring our food security. Then, so when we are talking about that, that will definitely come to, taking care of the environment and ensuring that the food security of the people are ensured. And the majority of our people are also living in rural areas, more than 85%, and dependent on agriculture. So without addressing this 85% of people, it is impossible to get out of the food insecurity. So the focus is that. Out of those 85%, again, is that the majority are smallholder farmers. So our focus of the policy, and whether we talk the green growth, looking into improving the land productivity, has focused on smallholders farmers. And of course, we have huge area of land that can be mechanized in the future, very big areas. More than 3.6 million hectares of land are being identified as a land that's not touched so far, which we will be actually expanding on those areas without affecting the forest and tree coverage. So potential areas where land development is possible. So the reality is, the fact is that why we are focusing on small-scale farmers, the reality is that. But still, there is a chance also for large-scale farmers. For the large-scale farmer, what we need to look into is that the challenge will be there. And the large-scale farmers, most of the case, the large-scale farming are the private sector that will be involved in investment, will be maximizing profit. Then profit can come even by disturbing the environment. So care has to be taken in that regard. Environment in one hand, and also maximizing the benefit that we'll be getting from the farmland. But still, again, there is an opportunity also in large-scale farm areas. Now you can also produce green fertilizer in those areas for the market and the other. I think these are the very important things that we need to look into that aspect. Yes, subsidies, actually we need to check that. But subsidy sometimes is important if it is for short time. At the beginning, to create a benefit. Creating a benefit like an incentive at the beginning is maybe unimportant as an incentive. But if you provide subsidies continuously, it will be part of rent seeking. So subsidies can be considered as one of the rent, but rent that is given for short period is okay, it's unacceptable, because it will be economical, it will be productive. But if we keep on subsidizing all the time, that means we are putting things that are not bringing any product, any change, so economically. So I think that needs also to be looked into. Internationally, the market has to be equal for all to compete. Those who are not having subsidies continuously, and those who are having subsidies cannot compete in the market in the same level. I think this is an area that we need also to look into for promoting green growth. The farmers who are producing in that way have to get educated and a better income also. That again requires certification. So the product can be labeled, the product can be certified that it is green, and also it can also be getting better price and better income also for the farmers. So that, I think, from the viewpoint of the issues that was raised, and another important issue with regard to the type of technology that is used. As you have said, that you have to provide options, but sometimes also we need to take care not to, always try to shoulder the the problems of the farmers all the time. But the farmers should work and develop their agriculture in such a way that they are free to decide what type of inputs, what type of activities they have to be undertaking. But we have to make sure that there will not be any skill and knowledge gap in that doing. So if there is a knowledge and a skill that can support the farmers, then they can choose the technologies that they think will be advantageous for them. But in organized way is better. Mobilization, for example, for us, while undertaking the natural resource management activities and watershed management activities for protecting environment, our farmers do their job in group, in team. They have a network, 1 to 5 network. Every farmers have one leader for 5 farmers. They work together. They identify together the problems of the environment and their actual problems in the ground, and they decide on the interventions that they have to put in place. And later on, when they decide on what type of interventions that they put in place, during the implementation, they contribute their labor together. So they know who has to carry which type of activity, the women, the youth, and the elders. They have their own ways of calculating the labor that is contributed to the farmers. So farmers' mobilization, if you really show and if you really leave them to discuss on their own actual problems, and they think that they do for their own, and the benefits they will be getting from that activity is going to go to the farmers, then you don't need much. They will mobilize themselves and they can work together.
A very hopeful approach, Minister.
Thank you very much. Well, a number of issues raised. Peter King, I think was your name. The food waste is definitely a huge challenge. I think it's about 25% of all food that's lost between the farm and the fork, or I guess in this region, the chopstick. So 25% approximately is lost. It's a huge challenge, and we need to work much more sincerely on doing so. I will hope you will come to the Global Green Growth Forum in October in Copenhagen, where they will launch a public-private partnership to develop a food waste protocol, and the actors behind it is FAO, it's Walmart, it's Unilever, it's a number of the big players. Because can we just gain a few percentages there, it actually means a lot. Agricultural subsidies in Europe, I was of course deadly against it until I got my own farm. And now I fully understand the rationale behind it. No, but I've been fighting those subsidies for 20 years in various capacities in civil society and in academia. They have improved a lot, and because they are not linked to the size of the production anymore, so the distortive impact of agricultural subsidies in Europe is much less today than it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago. But obviously still they have a distortive effect, although you are paid the same regardless of what you do on your land. And as said, on my land I choose to do almost nothing. I get the same subsidies regardless of what I do. I can even get more subsidies now by doing climate mitigating agricultural practices. So slowly the subsidy scheme is turning in a much more beneficial direction in Europe. Much less production distortive and more in favor of environmental practices that are also helping to mitigate climate change. But definitely a lot needs to be done still, and we are all in Denmark at least in the forefront of trying to get even higher reductions in agricultural subsidies in Europe, and use the money, which they can be much more beneficially for a lot of other purposes. I definitely believe with Minister Getahun that subsidies are needed in many poor countries. I think the Malawi case is a good one, where you turn a country from food importer to food exporter in a few years by targeted subsidies, vouchers for fertilizer and seeds to poor farmers. I think it was a needed exercise, but I also fully agree that there need always to be a sunset clause. You need to make sure that when you install these subsidies, you say from the very beginning that it's 5 years, 2 years, 10 years, whatever, a sunset clause always when you introduce agricultural subsidies. If not, you're gonna end up in the mess we had in the European Union. GMOs, well, you know, I'm not scared about the technology. I'm a little bit scared about ownership, as you are, as well, because exactly the intellectual property rights regime surrounding GMOs can definitely lead to a very narrow ownership, which is going to lead to higher prices. And if you look at how did we develop the agriculture in Denmark, it was by free and publicly financed agricultural research given to farmers, freely utilize it, share it, and that regime is over for sure. But I think we need to put the brake on a little bit in terms of intellectual property rights in seed, the new seed variety protection, patents on genes and plants and all that. You know, I think we need to be very careful, and especially in developing countries where there's a huge need for freely available research and new products and varieties for farmers. So I share your concern. There was a number of in Indonesia, May from UNESCO and others who asked about this, what kind of organizational model and big scale farms or small scale farms, community farms, and I think, you know, I think the experience of 50 years of agricultural development partnerships from Denmark is that we cannot impose any organizational model almost on anybody. It has to grow from farmers themselves, you know, and there are all kinds of different models. You know, we tried our best to promote cooperatives in Latin America and Africa for so many years, and many of them failed devastatingly. It total disaster. And the guy who you know, so many bad experiences with the cooperative movements in many countries. It has to grow from farmers themselves. Some places, community-based organizations can play a big role, like in India. Other places, the cooperative movement still has a role because farmers can see a benefit from it. In other places, I think we will see an interaction between large-scale investments from outside or from the country themselves. In Ethiopia, I visited garments in northern Ethiopia, where the richest man in Ethiopia, he bought 1,500 hectares where he grow cotton. He processes it now to textiles and t-shirts, and then they have an outgrower scheme where they buy from thousands of local farmers to buy cotton as well. Such a model is suitable probably for that part of Ethiopia. I don't know, Minister, what your say on it is, and I've seen it in other places. You know, the combination of larger scale farms that grow storage capacity, marketing capacity, research capacity, and even extension capacity on a private investment, and then outgrower schemes to thousands of local farmers can also be an appropriate model. You know, there are all kinds of models that will fit. And finally, perhaps the question from Papua New Guinea, what to do in a country that can't grow its own food, and that's what I heard you saying. Well, food security for me is not food sovereignty. You know, I'm not in favor of the concept of food sovereignty, but I am in favor of food security, and you can gain food security by all kinds of means that has nothing to do with growing food, and that's of course what Papua New Guinea has to do. But then I'm really fascinated by the prospects of fish farms. I don't know whether you do it in Papua New Guinea, but I was in it. You know, in fish you can actually make 1 kilo of fish with less than 1 kilo of feed, because they drink so much water. But you know, that's much more efficient than, of course, beef. You know, you need 10 kilos of feed to produce 1 kilo of beef, and so on. So fish farming is actually a very efficient use of resources and production of protein. And I think we're going to see it big scale in the coming decades in many places in the world. But it has to be done in a way that doesn't, of course, damage the environment as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. Ms. Thompson. carbon farming initiative received quite a bit of attention.
It has, and I just wanted to pick up on the Minister's points about the need for all kinds of models, both small scale and large scale. And the thought that sparked in me was the thought that actually, whether it's small scale or large scale, if you're rearing livestock, then you will be emitting methane. And one of the exciting things about carbon farming is one of the approaches we're using to reduce methane has a raft of green growth implications, which is generating electricity from a digester that captures the methane emissions, which means that you reduce the emissions, you can also create energy. And I'm aware in Africa there's some mini digesters being used on farm as well, which also create huge energy benefits for the local farmers. But I also wanted to pick up on the question about how can you stop the CFI from impacting on food security, and I thought that was a particularly nice question, so thank you. Actually, what we've done with the Carbon Farming Initiative is put in place a range of regulatory barriers, if you like, to stop exactly that kind of impact. When we were consulting on the scheme, we had a very strong alignment of farmers and green environmental NGOs, which doesn't happen all that often, but very much did so on this occasion. And the concern was that the Carbon Farming Initiative would create a very strong incentive for tree planting. And you'd see what was known at the time as the March of the Pines, where all these trees were planted all the way across the landscape and have impact on local farming communities. So what we've done is we've created something called the negative list, and that's regulation that sits alongside the carbon farming scheme that says that if a particular type of project is likely to cause negative impacts on local communities, employment or the environment, things like creating water shortages, then it's actually just banned from the scheme. And we have a process of public consultation that sits alongside that, and the Minister for Climate Change can just make certain activities under carbon farming ineligible. And we think that's going to be quite an important way of safeguarding agricultural productivity, even though you can still get credit for planting trees.
Mr. Pandey, you get to have the last word. There were lots of questions, of course, but one question that is particular is that how do you engage, when you say that the community initiatives, how do you make that happen? And if you could relate to that, with that, the question of how the need of the moment, of course, is a lot of food production, and can we get there through this kind of community action?
Yeah. So I think on the question about community sustainable agriculture, can it be scaled? I think our experience shows that if you do the initial things right, then you can scale this thing. And the initial things right is what I was mentioning, setting up the institutions of the poor, making sure that they are organized into self-help groups and community groups, because I think that really is the starting point. Only then does the knowledge dissemination process work. Otherwise it doesn't work, and otherwise you don't get the scaling up of the practice of the type that you need. Can it actually help meet the food security imperative? That's an important question, and I think here what we see is that it's not that the yields go up in the conventional sense, that you're not using a seed which will give you a much higher yield. But what you are doing is, by using different agricultural practices, you're doing polycropping, you're doing multi-layer cropping, you're doing better soil conservation, you're doing much better nutrient management. All these practices were not being done by small farmers before. So because of that, the aggregate production that they get actually goes up. And also, if you have better market linkages and feedback on what they should produce for the market, they actually produce more value-added crops than they were earlier producing, and at least they mix that up with their conventional crops. So you see not only an increase in income, but an increase in the agricultural production. I'm not saying this is a silver bullet, that this will solve all our food security problems. I think, as many people have suggested, there will need to be multiplicity of models we need to explore. But I think definitely there is enormous potential in this community-based sustainable agriculture thing. Just one thing on the GM thing, I think since it was raised, I think we need to be cautious on GM as far as food crops are concerned. I think India's own experience here is that we experimented with cotton. It's been depends who you ask whether it's been a success or not, right? So there's a big lobby which says it's been a huge success and so on. At the same, it's increased incomes of a lot of farmers, but at the same time, it's led to many farmer suicides across the country because farmers in many cases have taken on a lot of debt, thinking that just by investing more and more in GM, they will get far. And the other complication, of course, is when you go into food crops. Cotton, of course, is a food crop. When you go into food crops, then you need to be 110% sure as far as the technology is concerned. India's own position on this is that there was a proposal a couple of years ago to introduce GM in brinjal or eggplant. And after a lot of thought, it was felt that there isn't enough scientific evidence, there isn't enough incontrovertible evidence to suggest that it should be introduced. So there's a moratorium on the introduction of GM food, in this case brinjal. So I think there's a technology angle, but then there's also an angle of what kind of practices it sort of leads to. And I think we need to be a little cautious about how we proceed on that.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we have had a very interesting session, a very hopeful session. I was quite pleased and surprised, I must confess, that there is quite a bit of agreement in terms of the kinds of solutions. But then there is, from the questions at least, the sense that, well, we need to do a lot more, and whether these kinds of approaches are going to get us there, or as Mr. Pandey said, can they be scaled? And I think, we are talking about green growth, we are talking about sustainable development, and the solutions need to be sustainable. And the only way we can make it so is by empowering communities and making sure that the things that need to be done in the name of global sustainability are things that they can relate to, they can identify with. There are obviously lots of challenges. There are lots of questions about the examples that worked in one country and how they may be worked in other countries. And I think the Green Growth Knowledge Sharing Platform, as well as the best practices, the folks are here. And I think some of the questions coming out of this session, I think, need to go to them as well, so that they can see how they can feed us back with additional information about the kinds of things that work, and so on and so forth. With that, I think we have come to the end of our session, but before I close, I would like to ask all of you to give a very warm round of applause for our panels who contributed their valuable expertise throughout this session.